What if the most mysterious figures in the Bible were not just passing mentions, not just symbolic metaphors, but real beings whose existence was so unsettling that their memory was deliberately erased from history? In the 6th chapter of Genesis, we find a line that has puzzled scholars, theologians, and curious readers for centuries. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives, any they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and then, almost as quickly as they appear, they vanish from the text. A passing reference, one that leaves more questions than answers. Who were the Nephilim? Why did they provoke such terror in the ancient world? And perhaps more importantly, why did later religious authorities seek to minimize or even erase their story? The word Nephilim itself carries an aura of forbidden knowledge. Some translate it as giants, others suggest fallen ones. In ancient Hebrew, the root word NPL means to fall. But what exactly fell? Was it angels falling from heaven? Was it men who fell into corruption? Or were the Nephilim themselves a fallen hybrid race, the result of forbidden unions between the divine and the human? Each possibility is more unsettling than the last. The very ambiguity of the term has made it fertile ground for countless theories, biblical, apocryphal, and even modern conspiratorial. Consider the strange context of their introduction. The Nephilim are mentioned right before the flood narrative. Genesis tells us that the wickedness of mankind had become great upon the earth, that every thought of the human heart was only evil all the time. And in this dark setting, we are told of these giants. Could it be that the rise of the Nephilim was one of the final sparks of chaos that provoked the cataclysm of Noah's flood? The text does not linger, but its brevity almost makes the mystery more powerful. Like a whisper, it suggests something too troubling to elaborate on. But the Bible is not the only place where the Nephilim appear. In the book of Numbers, the spies sent by Moses into Canaan returned trembling, saying they saw the descendants of Anak, who were of the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Again, the image is overwhelming, being so vast that men compared themselves to insects. Were these literal giants, taller and stronger than any human? Or was the word being used to describe tyrants so powerful they seemed superhuman? The line between metaphor and reality blurs, but the effect remains the same: awe, fear, and a sense of something unnatural. Yet when we turn to other ancient writings, the silence is broken. Jewish apocrypha such as the Book of Enoch and Jubilees expand this fleeting mention into a vast story of cosmic rebellion. There, the Nephilim are born from angels who descended to earth, lusted after human women, and fathered monstrous offspring. These giants devoured the land, taught forbidden knowledge, and corrupted humanity until God had no choice but to wipe the slate clean. If Genesis leaves us with a question mark, these apocryphal books draw the rest of the sentence. But those books, of course, were excluded from the canon, and that raises the question: was it because their teachings were too strange, too mythic, or too close to an uncomfortable truth? Imagine for a moment what it would mean if even a fraction of these accounts were literal. It would mean that human history once contained a chapter erased not by time, but by intention, a chapter of hybrid beings, of angelic rebellions, of a world spiraling into chaos. It would mean that the flood was not only a story of divine judgment against sin, but also a cosmic cleansing of genetic corruption. That is a thought that unsettles the boundaries between theology, mythology, and science. The very name Nephilim has become a kind of cultural echo. It surfaces in folklore, in occult traditions, in medieval demonology, even in modern pop culture. But behind all of these echoes lies the faint memory of something ancient, something that the biblical writers felt compelled to mention, yet feared to expand. A name that suggests power, danger, and something profoundly out of place in the human story. The mystery of the Nephilim is not only about what they were, but also about what their story represents. Were they erased because they never existed, or were they erased precisely because they did exist? History has a strange way of hiding its deepest truths behind silences and omissions. The Nephilim belong to that shadowed category of memory where myth and fact blur, and where fear itself may have been the reason for censorship. And so, we return to the haunting question: if the Nephilim once walked the earth, what else has been hidden from us? What other fragments of truth remain buried in apocryphal texts, dismissed by councils, or whispered in traditions deemed too dangerous for mainstream faith? Perhaps, in uncovering their story, we are not only investigating giants of old, but also uncovering the giants of forgotten knowledge, truths that challenge the very structure of what we believe. If the first glimpse of the Nephilim left us with haunting questions, the next step must be clarity. Not sensationalism, not vague speculation, but a careful unfolding of what the sources actually say and what they imply. So, let us set out on this journey with purpose. The goal is threefold. First, we will examine every trace the Bible itself gives us about these beings. What does Scripture really say, and what have translations or traditions obscured over centuries? Second, we will bring forward the voices of apocryphal texts, those works left outside the canon, yet preserved in libraries, monasteries, and ancient traditions, that shed a sharper if unsettling light on the Nephilim. Third, we will trace how these fragments echo through history and culture, asking how they might reshape our understanding of humanity's place in a cosmic struggle. That is the promise: to walk into the fog, gather what fragments of truth remain, and emerge with a vision that is both unsettling and clarifying. By the end, you will not only know what the Bible and ancient texts claim about the Nephilim, you will also see why their story was considered too dangerous for common teaching. But before diving deeper, we must recognize the strange paradox that defines the Nephilim. On the one hand, they are barely mentioned in the canonical Bible. 2 brief references in Genesis and Numbers, a handful of echoes in later traditions. On the other hand, those few words have inspired entire bodies of literature, theology, and myth. Why? Because what they suggest disrupts the normal categories of belief. If the Nephilim were merely giants, the story could be passed off as a tale of extraordinary men. But if they were something more, hybrid beings born of heaven and earth, then they challenged the very boundary between the divine and the human. This boundary, throughout Scripture, is carefully guarded. Angels appear, yes, but as messengers. They intervene, but they do not cross into human relationships in a way that would produce offspring. The story of the Nephilim shatters that order, raising the possibility that heaven itself once rebelled not only in spirit, but in flesh. And that possibility is so disruptive that later interpreters either spiritualized the Nephilim away, calling them symbols of tyrants, or rejected the writings that gave them more detail. Why would ancient leaders do this? Why would councils of the early church and teachers of Judaism choose to silence such stories? The answer may be unsettling, because these tales implied a world far more chaotic than orderly religion could admit. A world in which divine beings could fall into desire, in which humanity could be corrupted at its core, in which God had to cleanse the earth not only from sin, but from bloodlines polluted by forbidden unions. Such a vision is less comforting than a simple story of human rebellion. It is darker, stranger, and far more cosmic. And so, as we move forward, it is important to remember the stakes. This is not just about uncovering a forgotten word. It's about confronting the possibility that biblical history includes chapters of strangeness, rebellion, and supernatural intrusion that we are not used to acknowledging. If the Nephilim were real, then the world of the Bible was not only one of shepherds and prophets, but also one where giants roamed, where angels disobeyed, and where humanity faced threats that came not only from within, but from beyond. But why does this matter for us today? Because our faith, our traditions, our understanding of the Bible are all shaped not only by what is included, but by what is left out. If stories of the Nephilim were minimized, censored, or forgotten, then restoring them, even just as a possibility, reshapes how we read Genesis, how we understand God's judgment, and how we interpret the forces of good and evil. So in this exploration, we will not shy away. We will trace their origins. We will listen to the voices of Apocrypha like Enoch and Jubilees, and we will confront the questions that surface when humans are said to walk alongside giants, when the sons of God descend to earth, and when corruption spreads so deeply that the flood itself becomes inevitable. Consider this your guidepost. By the time we conclude, 3 things will stand clearer. First, the Nephilim were not a passing myth, but a deliberate piece of the biblical puzzle. Second, their story was silenced not because it lacked significance, but because it contained too much. And third, in rediscovering their tale, we glimpse not only the past, but also the shape of a spiritual conflict that, in different forms, continues into our present. The Nephilim are more than footnotes. They are a key to understanding how ancient writers saw the fragility of human order and the danger of stepping outside divine boundaries. They are warnings written into the margins of sacred history, warnings we must now recover. When searching for the Nephilim in the canonical Bible, we discover something curious. They appear only in a few scattered verses, small fragments, almost whispers, but those fragments carry enormous weight. The first and most famous mention is in Genesis 6:1-4, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown." At first glance, the text seems simple. Humanity multiplies, heavenly beings notice human women, and a strange union produces offspring. But the verse is packed with questions. Who are the sons of God? Who exactly are the Nephilim? And why is this moment immediately followed by God's decision to limit human lifespan and to cleanse the world with the flood? The ambiguity begins with the Hebrew word Nephilim. Scholars debate its root. Some connect it to Naphal, to fall, suggesting fallen ones. Others link it to giants, drawing on later translations like the Greek Septuagint, which uses gigantes. The dual sense, fallen and giant, captures both a spiritual rebellion and a physical abnormality. These were not ordinary men. They were beings whose very existence disrupted the boundary between heaven and earth. Then comes the second question, the sons of God. In some traditions, these are taken as the righteous descendants of Seth marrying the daughters of Cain. But that reading raises a problem. Why would such unions produce giants or mighty men? And why would God react so severely, sending a flood to cleanse the world? The alternative interpretation, more ancient and more disturbing, is that sons of God refers to divine beings, angels or celestial figures, who transgressed their place and took human women, producing offspring that were neither fully human nor fully divine. This reading, unsettling as it is, explains why the text positions the Nephilim as a prelude to the flood. If humanity was not merely sinful, but genetically corrupted by unions with heavenly rebels, then the flood was not just punishment, it was purification. The human race itself had to be reset to preserve its integrity. Noah, described as blameless in his generations, might have been chosen not only for righteousness, but also for an uncorrupted lineage. The second major mention of the Nephilim comes much later, in Numbers 13:32-33, when Israelite spies return from Canaan, and they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Here, The Nephilim appear again, not as ancient history but as a living presence. The spies describe enormous inhabitants, terrifying in size, descended from these mysterious beings. Their report stirs fear, leading Israel to despair and rebel against Moses. What's striking is that the Nephilim are not treated as distant myth, but as a reality in the land of Canaan. The text suggests continuity, that these beings, or their descendants, survived the flood or reappeared afterward. This small detail, and also afterward in Genesis, suddenly takes on weight. Perhaps the flood did not erase them completely. Perhaps the corruption resurfaced, haunting Israel's journey into the Promised Land. Together, these two passages form the core biblical witness. Sparse, yes, but filled with implications. They open the door to questions that the canonical Bible does not fully answer. Who exactly were these beings? Did they survive the flood? Were the Canaanite giants, the Anakim, the Rephaim, traces of this ancient corruption? And if so, why does the Bible preserve only these glimpses, leaving us with more questions than answers? The silence may itself be a message. By leaving the Nephilim as shadows at the edges of the text, Scripture provokes curiosity, forcing us to confront mysteries that are not easily resolved. But this very gap is what gave rise to entire traditions of interpretation outside the canon. Traditions that expanded the story, filled in the missing details, and turned the Nephilim from a brief footnote into the central drama of cosmic rebellion. And so, having looked at the thin threads the Bible itself preserves, we are now ready to step beyond the canon and into the apocryphal writings, where the story of the Nephilim explodes into vivid detail. If Genesis whispers about the Nephilim, the Book of Enoch thunders. Among the apocryphal writings preserved outside the biblical canon, none gives more detail about the mysterious beings who once walked the earth. It is in Enoch that the shadows of Genesis 6 are filled with names, motives, and cosmic consequences. The central figures in this account are the Watchers, a group of angels entrusted with observing humanity. According to 1st Enoch, they were not meant to intervene beyond guidance, but their fascination with human life grew into desire. Seeing the beauty of human women, they conspired together, descending to earth on Mount Hermon. Their leader, Semjaza, convinced them to act as one. If they would all bind themselves by oath, none could escape the guilt of what they were about to do. And so the Watchers took wives, and from these unions were born children unlike any others, giants of immense stature and insatiable hunger. These offspring, the Nephilim, became a terror upon the earth. They devoured crops, livestock, and eventually human flesh. Their violence spread until the world groaned under their corruption. But the sin of the Watchers was not only in their marriages. Enoch records that they also revealed forbidden knowledge. Azazel taught the crafting of weapons, turning human disputes into organized warfare. Others instructed in cosmetics, enchantments, astrology, and sorcery. What had been a simple, ordered creation was twisted by premature knowledge and the misuse of power. Humanity, rather than growing in the rhythm intended by God, was accelerated into corruption by secrets that belonged only to heaven. The result was devastation. The giants drained the earth of its resources, and human society fractured under violence and lust. The cries of the oppressed reached heaven, and the Most High responded with judgment. In the visions of Enoch, God commands the archangels Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel to act. The Watchers are to be bound and cast into the abyss, awaiting the final judgment. Their monstrous offspring, the Nephilim, are to destroy each other in war, their spirits left to wander as malevolent beings, a possible origin of the demons feared throughout later traditions. This expansion of the Genesis story reframes the flood. No longer simply a reaction to human wickedness, the flood becomes a necessary cleansing of a world consumed by hybrid corruption and angelic rebellion. Humanity was not merely sinful, it was being devoured from within by powers it could not control. Only Noah, said to be righteous and untainted in his lineage, could carry the seed of a restored creation. The Book of Enoch, though never included in the Jewish or Christian canon, except in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, was highly influential in the centuries surrounding the life of Jesus. Fragments have been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Early church fathers, such as Tertullian, knew of it and sometimes defended its authority. The Epistle of Jude even echoes its language, quoting a prophecy of Enoch about the coming judgment on ungodly beings. Why then was Enoch excluded from the canon? Perhaps because its visions were too strange, too cosmic, too filled with angelic drama and forbidden unions. Or perhaps because it implied that evil was not only a human choice, but also a result of celestial betrayal, a view that complicates the neat doctrine of sin and redemption. Whatever the reason, the story of the Watchers lingered at the margins, resurfacing in folklore, mysticism, and even medieval demonology. The picture Enoch paints is both horrifying and fascinating. It shows angels who abandon their station, humanity seduced by knowledge not meant for them, and giants who embody the chaos that follows when divine order is broken. It is a tale of cosmic boundaries crossed and of the dire consequences when heaven and earth mingle outside of God's will. And at its heart lies a question that reverberates even now. If the Nephilim were real, if the Watchers truly rebelled, then how much of what we call human history has been shaped by forces we cannot see? How many of our wars, our inventions, our struggles for power bear the mark of knowledge whispered by beings who should never have spoken? This is the unsettling legacy of the Nephilim in the Book of Enoch. Not just giants of flesh, but giants of influence, whose shadow stretches across ages. While the Book of Enoch delivers the most detailed vision of the Nephilim and their angelic fathers, it is not the only ancient text to expand on Genesis 6. The Book of Jubilees, sometimes called Little Genesis, also offers a striking retelling. Preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition and found in fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls, Jubilees frames the story within a cosmic timeline, assigning every event its proper place in the heavenly order. According to Jubilees, the descent of the Watchers was not a random fall, but a rebellion against God's appointed structure of time and law. The angels who were meant to guide humanity instead violated their trust, and their offspring became the source of increasing lawlessness on earth. Jubilees emphasizes that the Nephilim were not only physically overwhelming, but also morally corrupt. They taught humans violence, sorcery, and idolatry, setting patterns of disobedience that would echo through generations. This is where Jubilees introduces an important detail. The spirits of the giants, once their bodies were destroyed, did not vanish. Instead, they remained on the earth as wandering entities, seeking to oppress and corrupt the living. In later Jewish and Christian thought, these restless spirits were often equated with demons. Thus, Jubilees bridges the gap between the era of the giants and the ongoing reality of spiritual warfare. Evil did not end with the flood. It adapted, becoming unseen, yet still dangerously active. Other apocryphal writings support this theme. The Testament of the 12 Patriarchs warns about spirits of deception that trace back to the sin of the Watchers. The Book of Baruch and various pseudepigraphal works echo the idea that angelic rebellion left a stain on creation that only divine intervention could cleanse. Even the Greek translation of Genesis, the Septuagint, uses the word gigantes, giants, which carried connotations of chaos and rebellion in Greek mythology. In this way, the biblical and the cultural imaginations converged, amplifying the aura of mystery around these figures. The Church Fathers were not blind to these traditions. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Athenagoras wrote of angels who sinned and whose offspring produced corruption. For them, the Nephilim explained the origins of demons, sorcery, and pagan cults. Tertullian even argued that women's use of cosmetics was first taught by these fallen beings, an idea borrowed straight from Enoch and Jubilees. Whether one agreed with these interpretations or not, the fascination with angelic rebellion and its monstrous results was undeniable. What makes Jubilees particularly intriguing is its insistence that all of this was written on heavenly tablets, part of a cosmic order that humanity had neglected. To the author of Jubilees, history was not random, it followed a divine script. The Nephilim were not merely an oddity of ancient times, they were a symptom of a larger battle between order and chaos, law and rebellion. Their existence highlighted how far creation had strayed from the divine calendar and covenant. The idea of heavenly tablets also reinforces a point. The Nephilim are not folklore, but cosmic evidence. Their story was etched into the very records of heaven, a reminder of the consequences of transgression. For ancient audiences, this meant that the tale was not meant to entertain, but to warn. It was a call to remember that sin has roots deeper than human weakness. It reaches into the spiritual realm, where beings of power once defied the Most High. When we place Jubilees alongside Enoch, a fuller picture emerges. Enoch describes the Watchers and their hybrid children in vivid narrative. Jubilees explains the ongoing spiritual consequences and frames them within the divine timeline. Together, they transform the short verses of Genesis 6 into a sweeping drama of rebellion, corruption, and judgment. And yet, these writings were excluded from the canon. Why? Perhaps because their stories complicate the doctrine of sin, suggesting that evil is not only internal but also imposed by external powers, or perhaps because they preserve traditions that were considered too strange, too speculative, or too disruptive to the theological clarity the councils sought to maintain. Still, the echoes of these texts never disappeared. They filtered into Jewish mysticism, Christian demonology, and even medieval legends of giants. One cannot help but wonder, if these books had remained in the canon, how differently would we read the Bible today? Would we see demons not as vague tempters, but as the literal spirits of dead giants? Would we interpret human history as a constant struggle against the lingering corruption of the Watchers? And would our understanding of the flood and of God's justice shift to include not just humanity's sin, but a cosmic contamination that needed to be purged? The Book of Jubilees reminds us that the Nephilim were never just about size or strength. They represented a rupture between heaven and earth, a violation of divine order, and the beginning of a spiritual conflict that still echoes through faith traditions today. The story of the flood is one of the most familiar narratives in the Bible. Noah, a righteous man, builds an ark, gathers animals, and survives the deluge that wipes out humanity. Yet when we read this account in light of the Nephilim, the flood takes on a deeper and more haunting dimension. It is not merely about punishing human wickedness, it is about cleansing the earth from a corruption so profound that it reached into the fabric of creation itself. Genesis 6 sets the stage. Before God announces his plan to destroy the earth, the text describes the intermingling of the sons of God with the daughters of men and the birth of their offspring, the Nephilim. Immediately after this, the verses declare that every inclination of human thought was only evil continually. To many ancient interpreters, this order was no coincidence. The rise of the Nephilim symbolized the tipping point when sin became systemic, violent, and irreversible. The Book of Enoch makes the connection explicit. The giants, it says, consumed everything in their path. When food ran out, they turned on humanity, devouring flesh and spreading bloodshed across the land. Their presence twisted creation, introducing sorcery, forbidden knowledge, and lawlessness. God's response then was not only judgment, but purification. The flood was the reset button, a way to wash away the hybrid corruption that threatened to permanently derail his plan for humanity. In Enoch's vision, the judgment unfolds in two stages. First, the angels who led the rebellion are bound and cast into gloomy pits to await final judgment. Their offspring, the Nephilim, are struck down. But even in death, their spirits linger as restless, malevolent forces, the demons that would plague humanity thereafter. Second, the waters of the flood cleanse the earth, wiping away the physical evidence of this cosmic rebellion. Noah's Ark becomes not just a vessel of survival, but a sanctuary of purity, preserving a remnant untouched by the contamination. This perspective transforms Noah into more than just a righteous man. He becomes a defender of the covenant, chosen precisely because of his integrity in a world overrun by violence. Jewish tradition often emphasizes that Noah was perfect in his generations. Some interpreters take this to mean not only moral uprightness, but also purity from the genetic corruption that had spread through humanity. In this reading, Noah's family represented the last hope for a restored humanity, untainted by the legacy of the Watchers. The floodwaters then symbolize both destruction and rebirth. They annihilate the corrupted world while providing a clean foundation for a new covenant. God's promise to Noah after the flood, the rainbow as a sign, becomes a declaration that despite humanity's failings and the schemes of fallen angels, divine order will prevail. Evil may resurface, but it will never fully overcome the covenant between Creator and creation. It is striking that nearly every ancient culture contains some memory of a great flood. From Mesopotamian epics like Gilgamesh to traditions in Asia and the Americas, the motif repeats: gods, giants, or corrupt beings provoke divine wrath, and a chosen survivor preserves life through a watery cataclysm. For many scholars, this suggests a shared cultural memory, refracted through different lenses. For believers, it reinforces the biblical claim: the flood was not a myth, but a pivotal event in the history of the world, remembered by all peoples because it truly happened. Theologically, the flood raises uncomfortable questions. Why would God choose such a sweeping judgment? Why destroy not only the wicked, but also animals and ecosystems? When viewed through the lens of the Nephilim, the answer sharpens. The corruption was not confined to human behavior. It infected creation itself. The violence, sorcery, and unnatural unions destabilized the entire order. The flood was not indiscriminate cruelty, it was surgery on a diseased body, painful but necessary to preserve life. Even so, the flood is not presented as the final solution. Sin returns after the waters recede. Noah himself stumbles, and his descendants spread across the earth, carrying both promise and rebellion. The Nephilim disappear from the biblical text, yet hints of giants re-emerge later, in the Anakim, the Rephaim, and even the Philistines. This suggests that the legacy of the Watchers was not completely erased, raising the question: did some bloodlines survive, or did the spirits of the giants continue to influence the nations? For the authors of apocryphal texts, the flood was both a historical and cosmic event. It dealt with physical beings, but also spiritual realities. It explained why demons exist, why evil persists, and why humanity continues to struggle despite the cleansing waters. For Christians, the flood prefigures baptism, the act of passing through water to emerge as a new creation, free from corruption and bound to God's covenant. In this light, Noah's story is not just ancient history, but a pattern that repeats spiritually in every generation. Seen through the lens of the Nephilim, the flood is no children's story about animals marching two by two. It is the climax of a cosmic battle, a decisive act of judgment and mercy. It reminds us that evil is not abstract but invasive, and that God's justice, though severe, is always aimed at restoring the balance of creation. The flood was supposed to end it all: the violence, the corruption, the unnatural unions between heaven and earth. And yet, when we continue reading the Old Testament, a strange detail emerges. The Nephilim, or their descendants, seem to appear again. Numbers 13 records the spies who explored Canaan, reporting that they saw giants in the land, descendants of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. They describe themselves as grasshoppers in comparison, overwhelmed by the sheer size and strength of these beings. How could this be? If the flood cleansed the earth, why would giants resurface in Israel's story? Some interpreters argue that the term Nephilim was used loosely, describing any unusually large or intimidating people. But the biblical language and the fear of the Israelites suggest more than metaphor. For ancient readers, the echoes of the pre-flood world seem to linger in the Promised Land. The Anakim, Rephaim, and other giant clans mentioned in the Bible provide a trail of continuity. Deuteronomy 2 and 3 speak of giant peoples who dwelled in the land before Israel's conquest. Og, king of Bashan, is described as the last of the Rephaim, with a bed over 13 feet long. These descriptions go beyond poetic exaggeration. They preserve a tradition of formidable beings who stood as obstacles to God's people. Some traditions held that the bloodline of the Nephilim survived through the wife of Ham, Noah's son, or through hidden refuges during the flood. Others suggested that the fallen angels descended again, repeating their rebellion in the post-flood world. Either way, the presence of giants in Canaan served as a test for Israel. Would they trust God's power to overcome the remnants of this corruption? Or would they retreat in fear as the spies initially did? The fear was real. When Israel hesitated to enter the land because of the giants, God declared that their lack of faith would cost them 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. The giants then were not only physical threats but spiritual barometers. They exposed Israel's courage, or lack thereof, in trusting the God who had already defeated greater foes in Egypt. Later, in the stories of Joshua, Caleb, and David, the giants become more than enemies. They become symbols of faith, tested against impossible odds. Caleb, at 85 years old, declares his readiness to drive out the Anakim from Hebron. David, the young shepherd, faces Goliath, a Philistine champion of giant stature. These moments are more than military victories. They represent the triumph of faith over the lingering shadow of the Nephilim. The persistence of giants in biblical memory may also reflect the belief that evil, once introduced, does not vanish easily. The flood purged the world, but the legacy of the Watchers lingered in bloodlines, in cultures, and in spiritual oppression. In this way, the Nephilim serve as a metaphor for sin itself. Even after judgment, it resurfaces, demanding renewed faith and courage to confront it. Apocryphal texts reinforce this idea. The Book of Jubilees insists that the spirits of the Nephilim became demons, roaming the earth to tempt and corrupt. These spirits did not disappear with the bodies of the giants, but continued their influence in unseen ways. Thus, when Israel faced giants in Canaan, the battle was not only against flesh and blood, but also against spiritual forces of darkness. Interestingly, the Dead Sea Scrolls, written by the Essene community around the time of Jesus, contain references to giants and their spirits. For the Qumran sect, the world was still haunted by these ancient enemies. They saw themselves as the righteous remnant, resisting not only Rome, but the spiritual legacy of the fallen angels. In their hymns and prayers, they plead for deliverance from demonic forces rooted in the age of the Nephilim. The persistence of giant traditions also seeped into folklore beyond Israel. Greek myths of titans, Norse legends of Jotnar, and countless cultural memories of great beings who fell from divine or semi-divine origins all resonate with the biblical narrative. For many, these parallels suggest a shared ancient memory of a time when giants walked the earth. Whether one interprets the post-flood giants as literal descendants, symbolic representations, or echoes of demonic presence, the message remains consistent. Humanity cannot escape the shadow of rebellion without divine help. The giants stood as reminders that sin, once unleashed, requires constant vigilance and faith to overcome. And so the Nephilim story did not end with the flood. Their echoes reverberated through Israel's journey, challenging the people to trust in the God who alone could defeat them. For readers today, the giants remind us of the persistence of evil and the need for courage rooted not in our strength, but in divine promise. The mystery of the Nephilim does not remain confined to the pages of the Hebrew Bible. Across the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to Greece to the distant corners of northern Europe, cultures preserved tales of giants, fallen beings, and half-divine heroes. These stories, though differing in details, echo the biblical memory of a time when the boundaries between heaven and earth were breached. To understand the Nephilim fully, we must widen our gaze beyond Israel and consider the global footprint of these legends. In Mesopotamia, one of the oldest cultural centers, myths tell of semi-divine kings who ruled with extraordinary power. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the earliest surviving works of literature, describes a king who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. Gilgamesh is portrayed as a giant, a figure of immense strength who seeks immortality but fails. For many scholars, the parallels with the Nephilim are too strong to ignore. A powerful hybrid being, born of gods and mortals, dominating humanity yet ultimately subject to divine judgment, the pattern aligns closely with the biblical narrative. Egyptian traditions also hint at a fascination with beings larger than life. The towering statues of pharaohs and gods, though symbolic, reflect a cultural imagination where rulers were perceived as semi-divine, straddling the line between humanity and deity. Some Egyptian myths describe primordial gods battling chaotic forces in forms that resemble titanic struggles between divine and monstrous beings. While not directly tied to the Nephilim, they share the theme of beings who exceed human limits, often with destructive consequences. Moving westward, Greek mythology introduces us to the Titans, gigantic offspring of primordial gods who ruled before the Olympian deities. They were cast down in a great cosmic war, confined to Tartarus beneath the earth. This story of rebellion, divine punishment, and giants locked away in a subterranean prison mirrors the account of the Watchers in Fur Enoch, who are bound in chains under the earth until the day of judgment. The resonance is striking, a universal motif of divine beings who transgress and produce chaos, ultimately subdued by higher powers. Norse mythology preserves similar traditions in the Jotnar, or frost giants, who existed in tension with the gods of Asgard. These giants embody primal chaos, challenging the divine order until the final cataclysm of Ragnarok. Again, the theme of divine beings intermingling with the world, producing turmoil and facing inevitable destruction recurs. These myths suggest that humanity's collective memory carries the imprint of ancient encounters with forces that exceeded normal human experience. Even in the Americas, indigenous traditions recall giants. Native American legends from tribes such as the Paiute speak of red-haired giants who once roamed the land, eventually destroyed by floods or wars. While these accounts differ greatly from the biblical text, their persistence across cultures indicates that stories of giants were not isolated inventions, but widespread motifs. How should we interpret these parallels? One view is that they reflect independent attempts by different societies to explain natural phenomena, such as the discovery of oversized bones, which could have belonged to extinct megafauna. Another view, embraced by some biblical scholars and theologians, is that these myths represent distorted memories of a real ancient event, the rebellion of heavenly beings and the birth of giants, preserved in fragmentary form across the world. The Book of Enoch supports the latter interpretation. It presents the Watchers and their offspring as cosmic rebels whose corruption extended beyond Israel to all humanity. If this account was widely known in the ancient Near East, it could easily have influenced neighboring cultures. Alternatively, if the event itself was global, then memories of hybrid beings and divine wars could have been transmitted orally across generations and geographies, evolving into myths as they spread. Archaeology adds another layer of intrigue. From time to time, claims surface of giant skeletons discovered in ancient burial sites. Most of these reports are later exposed as hoaxes or misinterpretations, but the persistence of such claims reveals a cultural readiness to believe in giants as part of humanity's forgotten past. The fascination remains alive, fueled by both faith and imagination. What unites all these cultural traditions is not merely the figure of the giant, but the moral undertone. Beings who cross forbidden boundaries, who embody chaos and hubris, who rise against divine order only to be cast down. Whether called Nephilim, Titans, or Jotnar, the giants stand as warnings against rebellion and corruption. For biblical readers, these global echoes reinforce the seriousness of the Nephilim account. They suggest that the story of Genesis 6 was not an isolated myth, but part of a broader human memory of a cataclysmic time when heaven and earth blurred. In this light, the Nephilim are not just characters of ancient scripture, but part of a shared cultural trauma, remembered in different tongues and traditions. Ultimately, whether one views these myths as distorted memories of real beings or as symbolic expressions of humanity's fear of chaos, they enrich our understanding of the Nephilim. They remind us that the question of giants, fallen beings, and divine rebellion is not unique to Israel, but woven into the very fabric of human storytelling. When the giants fell, their story did not end with their destruction. According to the apocryphal Book of Enoch and other ancient writings, the physical bodies of the Nephilim were wiped away, but their spirits remained. These disembodied entities, stripped of their flesh yet restless, became what later generations would call demons. Unlike angels, who operate under divine command, or humans who are bound to bodies, these spirits existed in a liminal state, corrupt, wandering, and perpetually seeking influence over the living. The Book of Jubilees describes this legacy with chilling clarity. After the flood, Noah prays to God for deliverance from the spirits of the giants, which continued to afflict humanity. God responds by commanding the binding of many of these spirits, but not all. Some were allowed to roam the earth as a test for mankind, stirring temptation, oppression, and violence. Here, the Nephilim are not merely ancient figures. They become a continuing force of spiritual opposition, their rebellion echoing down through the ages. This interpretation casts the Nephilim in a new light. Their destruction in the flood was not a full erasure, but a transformation of their influence from physical to spiritual. The giants who once oppressed humanity through sheer size and strength now haunted them invisibly, influencing minds, cultures, and nations. In this way, the Nephilim became prototypes of the demonic forces Jesus confronted centuries later. The New Testament lends weight to this view. When Jesus casts out demons, they cry out in recognition of his authority, sometimes referencing their torment before the appointed time. Some scholars link these cries to the judgment awaiting the spirits of the giants. If true, then the encounters between Christ and demons were not random acts of exorcism, but cosmic confrontations with the lingering legacy of the Nephilim. Early Jewish and Christian thinkers wrestled with this connection. Writers like Philo of Alexandria and Josephus referred to giants in ancient times, acknowledging their existence while emphasizing their corruption. Church fathers such as Tertullian and Augustine debated the nature of demons, often linking them to fallen angels, but occasionally leaving room for the idea of hybrid spirits, offspring of rebellion who lingered after the flood. For many, the explanation that demons were the restless spirits of the Nephilim provided a coherent bridge between Genesis 6 and the spiritual battles described in the Gospels. If demons are indeed the legacy of the Nephilim, then the battle against them is not merely moral or psychological, but deeply historical. It suggests that the chaos unleashed before the flood never truly ended, that humanity continues to grapple with the residue of a rebellion that began in heaven and spilled into earth. The Nephilim's shadow stretches across millennia, reshaping itself to exploit new weaknesses in each generation. This view also reframes the spiritual warfare language of the Bible, Paul's description in Ephesians 6 of believers struggling not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, and rulers of darkness, gains new resonance. If demons are the lingering essence of the Nephilim, then humanity truly faces ancient enemies, older than empires, bound neither by body nor by time. Cultural traditions across the world seem to echo this fear of restless spirits. Folk tales of shadowy figures, night terrors, and malevolent presences may represent cultural memories of encounters with what ancient Jews called the unclean spirits. For the people of the Second Temple period, these were not abstractions. They lived with a daily sense that demons, the offspring of the Nephilim, prowled the world seeking to draw humanity away from God. What makes this perspective so compelling is its continuity. From the giants of Genesis to the demons of the Gospels, the thread of rebellion remains unbroken. The Nephilim represent sin given form, rebellion embodied in flesh, then dispersed into restless spirit. Their existence reminds us that evil does not simply vanish when judged. It adapts, shifts, and persists until the final reckoning. And yet the biblical story is not one of despair. While the Nephilim spirits may haunt the world, their power is not ultimate. The flood curtailed their domination. The exorcisms of Jesus displayed divine authority over them, and the final judgment promises their eradication. The spiritual legacy of the Nephilim, though dark and pervasive, serves to highlight the greater reality of God's sovereignty. For modern readers, the Nephilim's transformation into demons raises profound questions. What if the fears we still sense in the night are not imaginary, but echoes of an ancient rebellion? What if the temptations and oppressions we experience are not just psychological struggles, but part of a cosmic conflict with beings older than our civilizations? These questions force us to see the world with spiritual seriousness, recognizing that the battle against darkness is not new, but ancient. The story of the Nephilim does not end with their fall. In many ways, it only begins there. Their shadow stretches into the present, shaping how believers understand evil, temptation, and the unseen world. The giants may no longer stride across the earth, but their legacy lingers in whispers, in shadows, and in the struggles of every human heart. The story of the Nephilim has never faded into obscurity. If anything, it has grown in fascination as modern readers, scholars, and seekers wrestle with the mysteries of Genesis 6 and the echoes that ripple through scripture and myth. Today, the Nephilim stand at the crossroads of theology, archaeology, conspiracy theory, and popular imagination. Giants of the past who continue to cast a long shadow across human thought. For biblical scholars, the Nephilim remain a puzzle of interpretation. Some take the sons of God as fallen angels, aligning with the Book of Enoch and Jewish tradition. Others interpret them as human rulers, powerful men who took wives as a demonstration of dominance, producing tyrannical offspring. Still others see the story as a symbolic tale of boundary crossing, warning humanity against violating divine order. Each view seeks to answer the same haunting question: who were these beings that so corrupted the earth that God sent a flood? The archaeological lens adds another dimension. From time to time, claims of giant skeletons resurface, often accompanied by blurry photographs or sensational headlines. Most are quickly dismissed as hoaxes or misidentified remains. Yet the fascination persists because of the human longing for proof, tangible evidence that the legends of the Nephilim were rooted in reality. Even without physical remains, megalithic structures like Stonehenge or the pyramids often spark speculation. Could such monuments have been the work of giants or their descendants? Mainstream archaeology does not support such theories, but the questions continue to captivate the imagination. In popular culture, the Nephilim have become symbols of forbidden knowledge and hidden history. They appear in novels, films, video games, and television series, often depicted as massive beings straddling the line between heroism and monstrosity. While these portrayals rarely align with biblical detail, they highlight a central truth. The Nephilim embody humanity's enduring fascination with what is larger than life, what breaks boundaries, and what lies beyond the ordinary. For some religious communities, the Nephilim are more than myth or metaphor. They are evidence of spiritual realities that continue to influence the world today. The idea that demons are the disembodied spirits of giants ties the ancient story to present struggles. Exorcists and spiritual warriors often see their work as a continuation of humanity's battle against the lingering influence of these beings. The Nephilim thus serve not only as a historical mystery, but also as a lens through which believers interpret the ongoing conflict between good and evil. This enduring fascination raises deeper questions about why the Nephilim matter. Perhaps it is because they represent the convergence of heaven and earth, a breach in the natural order that challenges our understanding of creation. They stand as warnings of rebellion against divine law, but also as invitations to consider the unseen dimensions of existence. To study the Nephilim is to confront the possibility that our world is more layered, more mysterious than we often imagine. The legacy of the Nephilim also speaks to human identity. If these beings were hybrids, straddling the line between divine and mortal, then they embody humanity's own tension between dust and divinity, weakness and greatness. The Bible insists that humans are made in God's image, not through illicit unions, but through divine intention. In contrast, the Nephilim represent a counterfeit version of humanity's destiny: power without holiness, strength without obedience, glory without humility. Their story forces us to ask, what does it mean to be truly human? Modern fascination with the Nephilim also reflects a broader hunger for hidden truths. In an age saturated with information, people are drawn to mysteries that resist easy explanation. The idea that there are secrets buried in ancient texts, suppressed by councils or ignored by mainstream religion, resonates deeply. It creates a sense of discovery, of recovering knowledge that was meant to be forgotten. The Nephilim, as forbidden giants, become a symbol of this pursuit, a reminder that not all knowledge is comfortable, and not all history fits neatly into official narratives. At the same time, the persistence of the Nephilim myth cautions us against obsession. While curiosity can inspire deeper study, the biblical text ultimately directs attention not to the giants, but to God's sovereignty. The flood was not simply a response to the Nephilim, but a reaffirmation of divine order. The later victories over giants in Canaan emphasize that faith, not size, determines destiny. Even in modern interpretations, the point remains. The Nephilim's shadow only highlights the greater light of divine power. In the end, the Nephilim endure not because we have solved their mystery, but because they remain unsolved. They stand at the edges of scripture and history, both real and symbolic, ancient and modern. Whether as literal giants, fallen angelic offspring, or cultural memory, they continue to provoke awe, fear, and wonder. The forbidden giants of the Bible remind us that the world is more than what we see, that ancient stories still speak, and that the boundaries between heaven and earth are thinner than we often realize. They may be gone, but their legacy of rebellion, of corruption, of fascination remains with us. And perhaps that is why the Nephilim matter most, not because we can define them with certainty, but because their mystery keeps us asking, searching, and remembering that the story of creation is far larger than we imagine.